Morning, everyone. The time is 5 o'clock. I'd like to call this special meeting of the Belton Independent School District Board of Trustees to order. This meeting's been duly called. Notice of the meeting's been posted in accordance with Texas Open Meeting Act, Texas Government Code, Chapter 551. Please note for the record that Ms. Lee is participating via video conference. Hello, Janet. Okay. First item on the agenda is public comments. I see we have some signed up. In accordance with District Policy BED Local, any person wishing to address the board during public comments must submit a public comments form. Public comments during a special meeting shall be limited to the items on the agenda. In order to comply with the Texas Open Meeting Act, the board may not respond to comments or otherwise discuss or act upon any issues that are not posted on the meeting agenda. Each participant shall be limited to 3 minutes in accordance with the board operating procedures. Speaking to board members in a disrespectful or threatening tone is unprofessional and counterproductive to a cause. We have a timer on the screen that gives you your allotted time. A sound will occur at the end of your time. So, first up will be Brenda Howard. Please state your name for the record. After that will be Janet Brown.
Good evening and thank you. Brenda Howard, Belton, Texas. I'm speaking to agenda item 3 and to 4. We only get one bite of the new construction apple with this bond. This bond should not contain anything except new construction. The public cannot get a new school any other way. Kudos to Matt Smith for understanding this. At the Chisholm Trail Board hearing, a bond committee member stated that Matt Smith wanted 3 elementary schools due to the fast growth, but that he was denied this because of maintenance issues. For example, Belton High School needs a new roof. Belton High School should get a new roof, but cannot because of the maintenance and operation dollars that go to salaries. As a matter of fact, it is touted that as an argument for the bond, that salaries take up 84% of the maintenance and operation budget. This should never be. There should always be money in the budget for maintenance of all of our facilities. According to the Society for Human Resource Management, the percentage of your budget allotted for labor, which includes employee salaries, also takes into consideration payroll, unemployment insurance, taxes, benefits, reimbursements, overtime, workers' compensation, leave time and holiday pay. Leave room in your budget for raises that may be earned by your top performers. Depending on your sector of business, you may spend between 40 to 80% of gross revenues on employee salaries and benefits combined. Salaries alone can account for 18 to 52% of your operating budget. How can Belton ISD be paying 84% of its maintenance and operations budget on salaries when we know that Belton ISD teachers make 17% lower than national average on their salaries? It does not take too much sleuthing of the public records to find out that our administration staff is making 211% higher than average and 153% higher than the median salary in Belton Independent School District. Maybe there are too many bosses and not enough worker bees, and I do understand I'm in a room full of admin people, so sorry about that. When this inequity is corrected, we can use bonds for new construction and again, increase the salaries of our teachers. I do hope someone sitting on this board does a review of these inequities, gets our budget back in shape so that when a bond is requested of the public, it truly addresses fast growth. Thank you.
Next is Janet Brown. Please state your name for the record.
Hi, my name is Janet Brown, and I'm from Morgan's Point. Yes, we must talk about preliminary tax values and how everything is bigger in Texas. Bell County citizens have received their property tax value appraisals. The real questions are about the longevity tax rate effect on citizens, who are the special interests behind the bond slogan, Vote Yes for BISD 2022 PAC, and will our board members stand up for the regular citizens who elected them? My family is directly affected by the actions of this Board of Trustees. Over the past 3 years, my property tax values have dramatically increased from $172,052 to $193,000 to $175 to $245,040 this year. Yay, me. I fully understand how people get taxed out of their homes. For the record, the original purchase of my home in 1995 was $87,000. Saying that this bond is not a tax rate increase is a lie to the citizens of Belton. Hear me on this. Do any board members have the guts to stand up for the citizens who elected you to serve? I am not looking at Mr. Norwood, who is currently under investigation for doing the opposite of looking after citizens, but I am looking at the rest of you. As stated in previous public comments, money and particular interest are built into this bond design. There is a promotion aggressively targeting Belton area citizens. The Vote Yes Belton PAC has collected approximately $36,000. This PAC campaign wraps up with paid door knockers, phone calls, and text messages, an action right out of the Democratic playbook. Do you know who the people are sponsoring Vote Yes BISD PAC, and are you as trustees okay with these extreme actions? All listing as Temple residents: Thomas Baird, Robert Browder, Perry Cloud, Michael Pilkington, Victor Turley, Home Builders Limited, Temple Futures donated $5,000, Temple Business League donated $10,000, First Omega Partners Limited, Temple Area Builders donated $5,000. From Austin, Bartlett Koch General Contractors. From Salado, David Patrick Don Ringler Jr. And finally, from our hometown of Belton, Rick Kasberg and J. Dixon Construction. It matters who is on your board development committee from the very beginning to the very end. I will fully support bonds that build schools in areas that directly support the education needs of Belton ISD families, and not because it will help a developer sell more homes. One must wonder why it is so difficult for parents, teachers, and regular citizens to have their concerns taken seriously and heard by this Belton ISD Board of Trustees. We, the people, want and expect truthful, ethical, and trustworthy representation from our elected officials. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next item on the agenda. Matt?
I'm excited to welcome Mr. Todd Schiller up, our Assistant Superintendent of Human Resources, with a great announcement for us here for Belton ISD.
Good evening, Board. It's my pleasure tonight to recommend to you a candidate for a CTO, Chief Technology Officer, by the name of Shad McGahey. Him and his wife are behind me here. And so Shad comes to us with multiple certifications in technology, has a degree from Midwestern State University, and has 22 years in education, or 22 years in technology, with 21 of those being in an education field. And since 2011, he has been the Chief Technology Officer in Wichita Falls ISD. So with that, I'll provide that for your recommendation for approval.
All right. Thank you very much. So do we have a motion to approve the recommendation and addition of personnel as presented? Ms. McDonald, do I have a second? Ms. Bass, all right, all in favor? All right, for the record, Ms. Lee has her hand up too, so that motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much.
And with that, I'll get him to step up here just for a quick second.
Okay, thank
And
you.
we'll probably do some pictures off to the right.
Yes.
Hello. Nice to meet all of you this evening. My family and I are very excited to be here in Belton ISD. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be able to help the teachers and the students of this district, and I look forward to hit the ground running. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. And, oh no, we take pictures.
Yes.
We're headed over here.
And your wife can come as well. That'd be great.
Sure, go ahead.
So just, I want to make sure our board knows, I think you've known, this search process has been lengthy for us. And we couldn't be more blessed to have Shad and his wife and family join in the Belton ISD community. And he's done great work where he's at, and we're excited to have him as a partner in our school district moving forward, and they're excited to join the Big Red community. And thankful for you all for that vote, and we're really thankful that he's going to get started with us in early June and get moving. So we're looking forward to the future. Thank you all.
Next item on the agenda, review, discuss preliminary tax values, tax rates, and interest in sinking tax rate analysis. I think we're going to have a couple of speakers, so I'll hand it over to Matt.
Yeah, so thank you all tonight for having this special meeting. We'll see if, there we go. Our current, well, we're going the wrong way. There we go. Our purpose for tonight is to discuss the pending preliminary tax value information, impacts on Belton ISD, and potential opportunities for the board to consider for the future. We obviously know that as appraised values come out, this is a topic that is important for us to consider as a school district and to discuss as a school district for our constituents in Belton ISD. So we called this meeting tonight. We knew that we would be getting preliminary values from Bell County Appraisal District, and we got initial information yesterday from them. And so we wanted to have an opportunity to talk to our financial advisor tonight, talk to Representative Hugh Shine tonight, who's in the audience and was willing to talk to us a little bit about maintenance and operations tax rate and tax compression, and also talk to Melissa Lafferty, our CFO, a little bit about what this means for our school district and what we're watching moving forward. This is a non-action item. This is just for discussion tonight. There's no impact or vote at the end of the night on this, but this is a specific topic that is important to all of us sitting up here and all of our constituents within the school district. So that's the purpose for this evening, is to be able to dive in and have good questions along the way. Feel free to ask your questions to any presenter. As a reminder, you can see the historical tax rates in our school district, and you see over the past few years where we've been and where we are currently, where we were projected to be prior to preliminary values in 2022. And yesterday we received the following information. You can see this up here on the screen. And you see that there are two charts there. The first is with the $40,000 homestead exemption for ISDs that is currently being considered across our state. And at the bottom you see the certified entity taxable value estimates without that $40,000 homestead exemption. So you do see that $40,000 homestead exemption that is currently being considered across our state does have an impact on the taxable value estimates for Belton ISD, according to our early numbers from the Bell County Appraisal District. I think it's important to make sure that we talk a little bit about this. So I'm going to invite Melissa up real briefly to talk a little bit about what we have here and what we need to consider, other items that we need to consider moving forward, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, so with those values, there are still some unknowns that we do not have currently. So we generally, when you start your budget process, you're trying to project what these values are going to be. When you start trying to figure out what your revenue projection is. And so moving forward, now that we have these values, I'll work closely with the appraisal district, and I'll need other pieces outside in those values, for instance, the frozen values. So we'll need those from Mr. White in the next coming weeks, and then I will start building those into our revenue projection. So right now, we're kind of waiting on those as we try to figure out what tax rates are, what that tax rate calculation might look like, and what our revenue funding how that will affect our funding as we continue on into our budget process. And as you were well aware that you start with those preliminary values, and then you as you get ready to adopt, you get those certified values in just before adoption, and that kind of gives you a better inclination of what your revenue is going to do based on those values. Now, if you'll remember, the values, as those values increase, They don't really affect your funding too much anymore due to House Bill 3. Most of that is the student growth. And so we're just kind of right now kind of in limbo, waiting on that additional information from the appraisal district moving forward.
Melissa, can you elaborate a little more on two things? One, frozen. What do you mean by frozen? What are we looking at for the frozen piece? And then two, a little bit more about waiting in limbo on some of that and how this doesn't really affect overall maintenance and operations
Sure.
budget.
So typically, you could easily take these values as you're doing your projections and estimate what that frozen value may be based on historical trends and kind of get within a ballpark. However, with that Proposition 1 at the state level, where they will go in and recalculate those values based on those compressed rates in the past, that kind of makes that a little muddy for us as we try to project that. So there's some of that unknown within the frozen values, and typically when the appraisal district gives us those, they're giving us the actual tax at that point. So they kind of pull them out of values and tell us, okay, this is what the tax is going to be on those values. So right now, I hate to almost guess what that's going to look like based on that. And of course, with the introduction of the increased homestead exemption, it's kind of creating a little muddiness too in those projections. So we're going to need clearer pictures on what those numbers are so that we have a better revenue outlook going forward.
So is it Proposition 2, is that what it is the homestead?
Yes,
That's
sir.
what that is?
Yes, sir, the
So
Proposition 2.
if it passes on the 7th, how long until it's implemented? Since y'all are putting this into this preliminary look, it's going to affect this next budget cycle? It's going to kick in that quick?
Yes. So I'm assuming that's a pretty straightforward one for the appraisal districts. They're already building probably those models with the $40,000 exemption. The one that could take some time is going to be the Proposition 1 on those frozen values and interpreting what the law is wanting us to do, and then them building the calculations around that. So that could take a little bit of time. So we will be ballparking that number and may have to come back and amend at some point. But again, I don't think it will significantly impact our state funding because that's mostly driven by our student growth.
Melissa, you mentioned that values did not affect us because of the House Bill 3 implications. Can you elaborate on that statement?
So with House Bill 3, that introduced the tax rate compression, the maximum compressed rate. So what happens there is that as those values continue to increase, and it's the states, their solution to help ease some of that tax burden is by compressing our tax rates. So as values increase, our M&O tax rate is calculated by TEA, and basically in that formula, and as those values increase, our tax rate is compressed. And so if you look back at historically at our tax rates since House Bill 3, that has been the case. As they continue, as you can tell from that slide, the M&O tax rate is decreasing due to those increased values.
And when you say compressed, you mean decreasing?
Decreasing, yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if someone, as we had a comment this evening, if we look at the last, 6 years here that we have on this slide? For
Yes,
the
sir.
M&O rate and then the INS rate,
Yes, sir.
right? Okay, so if someone comes in and says, well, my taxes have gone up in the last 6 years, that wouldn't be because of something that the school district did, it's because of the appraised value.
Yes, sir. The driving force to the increase in taxes is the values.
Right,
So if you were to leave, theoretically, if you were to leave your tax rate completely flat, and over time, it's those values that is causing that the tax increase to our taxpayers.
Now, the situation involving the proposition about the homestead exemption, if that passes, is that why folks have not received their tax statement yet? Because the state's going to apply that, the homestead exemption, if it passes?
No, sir. They should already be getting their tax statement, and it will give them their market value and then what the assessed value is on their taxes. and you're taxed on your assessed value, not market value.
Understood, but if the exemption goes up, then if that person receives an exemption, then it will decrease it, will it not?
Yes, so they start with that assessed value, and then the exemption is then deducted from that assessed value. So they will see a further decrease to that assessed value with that increase in exemption.
So what you might think it is now, it could be less in October?
Yes, sir.
If the proposition passes?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
You still have to apply by April 30th, though, right, to get the exemption?
I believe to get the exemption, you would have had to have homestead in the previous year.
Yeah.
The election's on the 7th, and it's one of the amendments on there.
Melissa, when the analysis came out from the county, and most of us received, I know I received mine this week, and of course, none of us want to pay more taxes, right? And when those things came out, it caused a cascade of issues to, I know I had folks calling me and asking me questions. So if we look at the tax rate, all right, is there any connection between what the tax appraisal district does and what the school district does in terms of assessing value?
And assessing value?
Yes.
So the school district does not have any part in the assessment of our values. That is done independently by the appraisal district. And of course, state law requires the appraisal district to appraise those values at market. So if they were to sell that home today based on market conditions, what's the value of that home? Now, appraisal districts get in trouble with the comptroller's office if they don't appraise those values within 5% plus or minus on each side of that market value. So every other year, they're required to go through a property value study with the comptroller's office to make sure that stays in check and that they're appraising at market value.
I had someone call me yesterday and tell me that they understood that the school district had some influence on the tax appraisal district and increase in the assessed values. That's completely false, is it not?
No, sir, we don't have any control over that.
Right, we don't do anything to assess value in any manner
No, sir.
whatsoever, is that right?
No, sir.
Okay.
We wouldn't even have the tools to be able to do that, so we're,
Right.
we're relying on the appraisal district to do that for us.
Now, when you look at the M&O rate, of course, as a school board, we set the INS rate. Now, can you tell us what the INS rate is, first of all?
So the INS rate is the rate that is applied to our tax rate, and that rate is calculated at a rate that allows us to make our bond payments, so principal and interest payments. So, and that is a yearly a calculation that we go through as we get ready to adopt a tax rate.
And tell us about the M&O rate. Is that something that this school board adopts?
And you also adopt the M&O rate. So both of those pieces of the tax rate are adopted, and they're adopted independently of each other because they're for two different purposes. The M&O rate is basically based on your property taxes. It's for our operations as a district to make payroll and operate the district. TEA basically calculates that rate for us because of House Bill 3 now. And so when we get those certified values, there's like a 2 to 3 week period where we have to go and put in our values in a template that TEA provides, and they calculate that rate for us. So we have very little control within that tax rate. There is an additional portion of that rate that we could control, but most districts right now are kind of leaving that rate flat just because it's such a burden on the taxpayers.
Okay, so the distinction between INS rate and the M&O rate, one huge distinction is that the INS rate we set as a board, correct?
As a board, yes, sir.
All right, so we can increase it or decrease it,
Yes, sir.
depending on what's going on, right?
Yes.
And then the M&O rate, that's something that TEA essentially says, here's the rate, and then we essentially adopt that. I mean, that's
Yes, sir.
basically how.
Now that's the case. We've lost a
right,
lot
so-
of control over the M&O rate.
Right, so we don't have, that comes from Austin,
Yes, sir.
right? Yeah, another question that someone asked me yesterday, that called me at the office, was all this stuff about the bond election and all those kinds of things. And one of the things that they asked me was, is it true that there's going to be a tax hike if the bond is approved? I mean, when we had workshops here and we had discussions here with Jennifer Ritter, we were told as a board, I mean, the representation that was made to us, that it would not increase the INS rate.
Yes, sir. So the bonds, again, our current rate is a rate that is high enough based on those values that allows us to pay off, that allows us to pay our debt service requirement. And so it's not a tax increase per se, but that's the only portion that we have control over is that rate.
Right, and I think, I'm sorry?
I think Ms. Ritter is going to be up in a little bit, and
Okay,
she's the
okay.
expert on the
Yeah.
bond rate.
Okay. I'll save the remainder of my questions for Ms. Ritter then. All right, thank you.
You bet.
Any other questions from our board for Melissa? Melissa can come back up in a minute, but I did want to let Representative Shine talk a little bit about tax compression, House Bill 3, and work that he's been working on through all of this as well. Everybody good? All right, thank you, Melissa.
Okay.
Thank you. And so, as you all know, Representative Shine's been working in our community for years and is a good collaborator with school districts, and he worked heavily on items in the 2019 legislative session and that have impacted school districts greatly and done great things for our school districts. And so figured I'd turn it over to him and talk a little bit about the maintenance and operations tax rate and tax compression.
Thank you, Superintendent Smith. Members of the board, last week we had Ways and Means Committee had its interim charges and committee meeting last week. We had charges that were set out by the Speaker of the House, and one of the major items was property tax relief. The governor has indicated to us as members of the legislature that in the 88th session of the next legislative session that will start in January, that this will be one of his priorities. So consequently, in our Ways and Means Committee last week, we took testimony in regards to property tax relief, what it should look like, how it could affect our communities across the state, and what was the protocol, what were the opportunities based on current law that would prevail that. I've been in Austin the last 2 days working on the same issue. As y'all know, I serve on the Ways and Means Committee and have 2 of the last 3 sessions. So our conversation has been predominantly what mechanism is available, and look at some historical data that we have from House Bill 3. What we did with House Bill 3 is we brought the state back into the fold, so to speak, of stepping up and adding funding for public education across Texas. We did that through a method called compression. And that compression is putting additional state money into the Foundation School program, and it's worked. As you could see, what you've reflected there, and I understand based on our discussions in the last 24 hours is that the average M&O tax rate for across the state is now down to about 89 cents. The other issue is we have $3 billion, that's billion with a B, that's ARPA funds, that the legislature at the end of the session did not expend, with the idea that we were going to hold those funds for the 88th session and look at allocating those funds. The preliminary consensus is, and this is, and I was today and yesterday in our discussion is this needs to be used for additional compression. We looked at alternatives of where else we could go with it or how we would use it for any type of property tax relief for property taxpayers, because myself included, as well as everyone on this board and people who are here today, we pay predominantly, you pay property tax either directly as a homeowner, or if you're a renter, you pay it in your rent. It's calculated in there. The preliminary consensus is the only mechanism that currently exists that we know works is compression of the M&O for our schools. There is no mechanism for the counties. There's no mechanism for the cities. And we have some history now since 2017 that indicates that it works. So my message, and I called Dr. Smith on my way back from Austin, and I was calling other superintendents after the meetings that I had were over, just to kind of share with them the discussion of what to anticipate, because y'all are going to get into a budget cycle. Some school districts are looking at bond proposals, some are not, but you're looking at a budget cycle regardless. And this is information that's important for you to have. If, in fact, we use this $3 billion of ARPA funds for compression in the next session of the legislature, we would probably be able to reduce the statewide average M&O rate by about 5 cents, by about a nickel. I think our school boards, particularly those that I represent, need to know that information, because you're in the process right now for your next budget process. And that's why I made the call, and Dr. Smith asked, since I was coming home this evening, if I would, and I didn't realize y'all had a special meeting, that if I would come by and convey and share that with you as board members. Makes it easier to share with you all at one time rather than making individual calls. I did make some other calls to other school districts on my way back from Austin to share that news with them as well, because that's important news. Number one, HB3 is working in helping reduce the M&O rate for schools across Texas. And if, in fact, we stick to the $3 billion for M&O for schools and compression, you will see some additional rate reduction across the state as well. So that's my message, and that's why I'm here. And in my discussion with Dr. Smith, he just asked that I come by and share that with you as well.
Thank you very much, Representative Side. Any questions? No? Okay, Mr. Taggart.
I've heard that because of the additional population growth we're having and the property value increases and things like that, that our budget surplus is going to be quite large this next go-around. Are y'all anticipating that being the case, and will there be additional funds with that?
You know, that's certainly a possibility. Speaking from an actual dollar, you know, on rates like M&O and those types of things, and what we're looking at on real dollars, that's going to be, that's a decision that needs to be made by the board, of course. But you can look at that and say, and interpolate it, and just and say, you know, this is a strong possibility. That's something that Dr. Smith shared that while y'all were having this special meeting tonight, which makes it even more important to share with you the preliminary discussions about what we're going to do with $3 billion, which is a lot of money, to put into compression for school finance. And that may, coupled with a decision that you make based on market value of property, might have be exacerbated a little bit in a positive way for taxpayers.
Thank you.
I just want to thank, I'm sorry, Manuel, you have a question?
First of all, Representative Shine, thank you for being here. I know that
Sure.
you've had a long day, so thank you for stopping by and visiting with us, because it's very important to us. One of the legislative priorities that I know that Dr. Smith and I have discussed is this issue about fast growth school districts. And maybe, because I asked Matt, I said, well, why can't we get additional funding? Because obviously, you know, somebody asked, well, what's the most significant issue you're dealing with? Well, first one's growth, the second one's growth, and the third one's growth, right? And everything that comes along with that. And one of the legislative priorities that I think that I would discuss with you would be this thing about fast growth, and if there's any talk about perhaps assisting those schools a little bit more than you would a school district that does not have that designation. In other words, define the school district as being fast growth and say, look, this is the additional, I mean, I know we get some additional, but maybe increasing that funding some. Has there been any talk about that?
It's a very important discussion. It is a discussion that takes place. It's a policy decision from the legislative body. Keep in mind that the state is so diverse with the rural representation that we have, the urban representation. We have rich schools, we have poor schools, we have recapture. You know, fortunately, I was in the legislature in 1986 when Robin Hood was first discussed, when Edgewood versus Kirby threw public school funding into the lap of the courts. And I can tell you that HB3, based on my experience both then and now, was monumental in making improvements. Because of the growth of the state, I think that there needs to be discussion and a debate regarding policy about schools that are fast growth. You're not the only school in Bell County that's going to be a fast growth. I'm already looking at that as a legislator because I've got a school district to the southeast of Temple, which is Academy ISD, which is going to fall in the same category just because of the growth of Temple to the southeast part of town, because the Academy ISD comes into the Temple city limits, just like the Belton ISD comes into the Temple city limits, and Temple continues to grow at a pretty good clip. So I assure you I'll probably be involved in some of those discussions about fast growth schools, because it's not just Belton that's going to be Academy. And as Austin continues to creep to Round Rock, to Georgetown, Salado, it's probably going to impact the Salado School District. And with Samsung going into Taylor, I'm pretty sure it's going to impact Holland ISD. So those things will definitely be priorities for debate and discussion, and looking at how funding can be more favorable for those schools that are fast growth.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
I want to make sure I thank Representative Shine for stopping by again.
You bet.
Oh, we do have one more question.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
To follow up on that, because you said if we are going to support fast growth school districts, and
I'm
that's
having
a policy
a hard time hearing you, Ms.
okay.
Bass.
So if it is a policy decision, what do you need from us as school board members? How can we be supportive as the legislative session starts to head back up, and you're starting those conversations? What can we do to help those conversations
You're already
along?
doing it because I have conference calls and meetings with your school superintendent and superintendents across Bell County on a pretty consistent basis. During legislative session, we have teleconferences every Friday morning. We talk about legislation that is pending in committee or coming out of committee, and we talk about legislation that is placed on the calendar for the next week. And my office reaches out to the superintendents, and we provide that information so that your superintendent is right on top of what's going on currently, so we can get feedback as to what they think may work, may not work, or if there's something that needs to be changed. And I'll be perfectly honest, that has worked very well on my behalf as your representative, because when I'm on the floor of the House and I'm talking to the chairman of the Public Education Committee, or if I'm talking to the Appropriations Chair, or my meetings on Ways and Means, I can just hand the cell phone in that phone call with Dr. Smith or with Dr. Ott or anyone else who has an idea for an amendment. And I'll be perfectly honest, we graduated seniors this past year in COVID because of an amendment that we were able to get on a bill that was sponsored by Democrat Bernal out of San Antonio. Because I don't remember the exact terminology that was there. I know Dr. Smith probably does. But if we hadn't gotten an amendment on that bill before graduation and got an immediate effect, we would have had we would have had 100,000 or so high school seniors that would not have been able to have graduated last year. And it was because of the line of communication and the fact that being right there and handing this to the member and getting it done and helping them get it out of the Senate and getting immediate effect, those kids graduated. That's the kind of relationship that I try to foster for our superintendents. So you're very well represented with your superintendent on our conference calls and on our discussions. And that's true for the superintendents we have in Bell County. They all participate. In fact, I even get superintendents from surrounding counties that ask to join the call because we've been effective with that. And I said, sure, why not, you know? And then I just convey or relay to the representative for those folks if they have some real concerns or something of that nature. I try to follow the protocol as best I can. Okay?
Again, we want to thank Representative Shine. He is in constant communication with us, and we appreciate it immensely. I can tell you I've been in other places that doesn't exist everywhere, and so we're thankful for our local representatives that do work hard to represent Belton ISD and Bell County. To his point, also in the fast growth area, we just had a presentation to region superintendents today And our demographer that is used for Belton ISD did a regional demographic study for Region 12, so all of the school districts within Region 12. Belton ISD was the fastest growing school district in the last 5 years, adding well over 2,000 new students to that in all of Region 12. The next fastest was Midway ISD, just over 500. So the issues are different in our district than they are in a lot of others. But that being said, to his point that he just brought up, Salado ISD, Academy ISD, and Troy ISDs percentage-wise are up there as well. So we do have a rapidly growing area here in Bell County that we talk about on a regular basis, and thank you for your continued work with us.
Let me just share one last comment, and this is how I feel about public education because it's very important. Y'all have the responsibility of making sure our children learn to read. And then it's also the responsibility for them, by doing that, then to be able to read so they can learn. And I think that our schools in Central Texas do a very good job of that. And thank you for your leadership.
Thank you, Representative Shine, and thank you for always being a champion of public education.
Thank you all.
Next.
If I could, I'd like to invite Jennifer Ritter up. And so based on current information, we know Melissa talked to us a little bit about our preliminary values and what we have to consider moving forward. Representative Shines talked to us a little bit about potential in the next legislative session, what's going on with that maintenance and operations tax rate. Just a reminder, maintenance and operations tax rate and interest and sinking tax rate are separate. Maintenance and operations is what Representative Shine was talking mostly about. And Jennifer Ritter, our financial advisor here, who is a great supporter of Belton ISD as well, is going to walk us through a little bit of this next information. I do want to point out, Board, we printed out a copy of Jennifer's slide for you because it is a little grainy and hard to read on the projector, and so you do have that printed out at your seat as well. So Jennifer, take it away.
Yeah, and I apologize, this is so small, but given the importance of this matter, we want you to have all of the detail, and everyone in the community to have all of the detail about how we're arriving at these numbers. When we started this process over a year ago, we didn't know where values were going to come in, that came in, quite frankly, this week. So what we've always done in the past for Belton ISD is project conservatively. And the idea behind projecting conservatively is that even though we're out there telling the community, here's the number that we anticipate on a tax increase, or in this case, no tax increase, we want to be better than what we're telling the community. So we start out conservatively, and hopefully if our projections are too conservative, we're able to come in a little bit better. And that's been the history at Belton, of telling the community one thing and then even being able to lower that tax rate after the bonds have been issued. So what we're looking at here is we started this process and we assumed a 7.5% growth rate in the tax base. Again, that's not set by Belton ISD, that's set by the appraisal district. The numbers that your CFO presented are preliminary. They're not certified yet, so we still have to wait until they're certified in July before we can actually have final numbers. But the preliminary numbers are certainly a good place to start and are usually pretty accurate and pretty close. So we still don't have final information. All of that to say, though, we will have final information by the time, should the voters decide to approve this bond issue on May 7th. We will wait to sell this bond issue until we have certified values. So that uncertainty about what we're saying tonight will be gone because we'll have certified values before we sell, and we will size this bond issue to be exactly what we told the voters or better. So the questions about whether or not we can hit this expectation, I mean, every assumption is simply an assumption until it's actually sold. But we'll make sure that we wait until we have the perfect information in front of us before we actually come to you with bids in hand and say, here's what the market's offering. We'll have that tax rate to be able to show you exactly what it's going to be because we'll have the interest rate and we'll have the certified values. So when we're looking at growth, we assume 7.5%. Last year you grew about 15%. So we started by backing it off by 50%, again, just to be conservative. So we've been operating this whole time under this, we can do this bond issue without a tax increase with 7.5% growth. Well, the numbers that came in this week are significantly higher than 7.5%. They're as much as 20%. But we don't know in those numbers yet, as your CFO alluded to, if the frozen properties have been backed out. Assuming that constitutional amendment, the First Amendment passes that would sort of address some of those inequities in the frozen collections, that'll lower to a certain extent. Some of those frozen values that you start to receive are a little harder for us to project on that. So you got two things working against you in favor of the taxpayers for the constitutional amendment. One's that frozen and the question about whether where that'll pass and where it'll end up, as well as that additional homestead exemption. We're assuming all those things pass, but we don't have all the information yet on how that's going to affect you. But we do assume that it will lower a little bit the information in terms of what the appraisal district sent out this week. So we're not going to project 20.4% because we simply don't know is that information layered in. With higher appraisals also comes higher protests. So certainly taxpayers are afforded the opportunity to protest and say that their value is too high. We expect that they will, and we expect that a lot of those will be successful, but we don't have that information yet either. So the numbers here that we're looking at assume 15% growth. So we backed off that 20% and come back down to 15%. If it's higher, we'll know when we sell that it's 20% or whatever it turns out to be. But again, this is a projection, and we don't want to overpromise to the community. So if we come out and we use 15% instead of the 7.5% that we've been projecting, all else remains the same. We're still looking at using some of that INS fund balance or that debt service fund balance. As a reminder, the INS fund balance accrues over a number of years. Based on higher than expected budget collections, it earns interest. That's how it starts to grow. It can't be spent on anything but debt service. It can't be transferred over to the M&O fund. It can't pay salaries. It can't be used for a building or turf or anything like that. It has to be used to pay debt service. So we're spending down about 60% of that to draw it down and make sure the taxpayers get the benefit of that. Spending down still the same amount that we've been looking at before, but when we layer in 15% growth in the tax base as opposed to the 7.5% that we've been looking at, even with the higher interest rates, because even though we had cushion in the interest rate when we started a year ago, we didn't have enough. Interest rates are continuing to go up, so we keep making sure that we keep raising that interest rate, again, to make sure we're covered. That'll lower the tax rate by about a penny when we layer in the 15% as opposed to the 7.5% that we were looking at. So basically, the taxpayers will get the benefit of any growth in the tax base that exceeds the initial expectation that we had. What we were telling them is what we were very certain that we could promise and guarantee, which was no increase in the tax rate. But as that tax base continues to increase, we can actually come in and we can lower that tax rate. Can't control the appraisal, so we can't say what the tax bill ultimately for each homeowner will be, but we can control what you all do in terms of the tax rate, which goes in then to set the tax bill that they receive. So I know it's a lot of information. The big moving pieces for us are the tax appraisal when it's certified in July, and we'll receive that. And then interest rates. Interest rates continue to climb. We expect that they will continue to climb up until the moment that we sell this bond issue. I'd rather be selling this summer than next summer. I think next summer we're going to be in an even higher interest rate environment, and even you can do even less for your money than you can now. So I think it's better to put it past you if you're able to do so. So the interest rate and the tax appraisal, those are the things that we don't have certain yet, but again, we're trying to still be conservative on those so that when we say to the community, we may actually be able to lower this tax rate by a penny, that we know we can deliver that when you come back and sell in July or August. It's a lot of information. Happy to answer any questions. Pretty much the same thing that you've seen, but we've substituted in a higher interest rate and a higher growth rate in terms of the tax base.
Jennifer, on this document, can you point out a couple of areas? I think this one is always one that overwhelms people when they look at it. Just a couple areas to look at. I imagine column C, the estimated growth, and what you've been modeling on that, and then what some of the rest of those columns are, just so our trustees are reading that appropriately.
Yeah, and so just kind of starting back, actually, I mean, obviously it's we do a fiscal year, it's not a calendar year because that's how you budget. The first column there is the freeze adjusted valuation. We, for purposes of selling bonds, have to subtract out the frozen amount. That's the properties that have the freeze over 65 or disabled. It's a little bit different than what you may see in some of the bills that go out because we're subtracting that. So that's the column that we're using there. Column C, as Dr. Smith mentioned, is the growth rate in the tax base. That's where we've substituted in the 15% for the 7.5%. But I will say that we're still being conservative going forward. We're not counting on 15 or 20% next year. We're counting on 7.5% thereafter. So should future years exceed what we're looking at here, which again is probably very conservative still, again, next year we could be in the same position where you're talking about potentially decreasing the tax rate again. But we're not going to count on these high growth figures going on forever because we, again, want to be better than what we tell the voters. Column D is the existing debt service. That's principal and interest for bonds that are already outstanding. Regardless of whether or not this bond passes, you still have to pay the existing debt service until it matures. And I just want to point out as well and kind of pat the board here and administration on the back. In talking about the debt service and the fact that you do owe this obligation, historically you've been able to exercise the option to refinance. Anytime the market moved, obviously we're in a higher rate environment than we have been traditionally, but because bonds have a 10-year call protection, after 10 years we're farther down the yield curve, so even if interest rates are higher, we're looking at a 10-year bond as opposed to a 20-year bond, so typically it makes sense to refund or save at that point. But over the past 10 years, this board has been able to save taxpayers. I was actually surprised when I added it up. Since 2012, you saved $18.3 million by taking advantage of lower interest rates to refinance debt when you've had that opportunity. So even though here in column D, that's the existing debt service of $353 million, it probably will end up being less because we'll probably be able to exercise a call option and reduce that pretty significantly over the next few years. Again, not certain, but something that we look at. Column E here is the projected new issue. So that would be assuming the bond is passed in May. That would be what we're looking at selling. We're assuming that we would sell in August with a 3.97% interest rate, which obviously sounds pretty high to this board, but again, we're being conservative. Current market today is probably about a 3.25% to 3.5%, so we still have a pretty good cushion on top of that to allow for it. And then column F here is the new issue and the old debt aggregated. You have an existing TIRZ, tax increment reinvestment zone, or TIF. That's more of a Melissa comment, so we won't go into that, but that is allowed for as well. Column H is you contributed $1.4 million last year just to buy down that debt service by paying off bonds early. And then column I there is the existing debt service fund balance that we have that we talked about using. So that will allow us to get all the bonds sold up at once, as well as lower that tax rate for your taxpayers. So by using those funds that you have on hand strategically, you're able to cut the amount that you're actually asking the taxpayers to pay for. Column J is where we add in the frozen taxes. Again, I said we're subtracting out of the value those frozen properties, but they do still pay taxes. They just pay taxes at the amount that they paid when their taxes were frozen. So those are allocated based on M&O and INS allocation and the percentage of the tax rate. You do still collect those. Column K is state assistance. You were receiving, the state was picking up a share of your debt service. As you become more quote-unquote property wealthy under state funding formulas, we're not counting on or anticipating you to receive that anymore after this year. So if you do receive a little state assistance, those models will be out here probably shortly, and Ms. Lafferty will have access to those. But if you do receive state assistance, that could potentially lower the tax rate even more, but we're not counting on it. So that'll be something nice. That'll be a windfall for you all to have. And then again, there's a total debt service, and the INS tax rate is calculated off of that. So I know that's a lot of information, but I want you to at least have everything, since we're kind of at crunch time here, early voting has started, so that you all in the community can have all the information, where the assumptions are coming from, and look at them and see that there's a lot of math that has gone into this, and it's not an opinion, it's a calculation.
So in relation to the bond, there's a lot of misinformation out there in the social media and different things. And one thing I'd like for you to explain so we can get this out there in print is part of the bond, we're talking about doing some transportation, and then Proposition B, with the technology. And there's someone that's out there saying that we're going to finance all that stuff for 40 years, which we're not even looking at 40 years on any of it. But could you explain where we can get this out there, how that works, and what the laws with the IRS are about those portions of this, please?
Sure, and understood how the confusion could arise. The bond ballot itself, I think, will say that you could issue up to 40 years. That's the state law cap. So typically that language that's actually put on the ballot itself is written based upon state law and what the requirements are. We would never sell 40-year bonds. I don't think we would have a very good buyer for them, quite frankly. These are projected to be 30-year bonds, which is typically what you do. And there is other reason, even if we could shorten it to say 20 years, and sometimes we might be able to pay it off a little early. But the other reason is that since we're talking about elementary schools and facilities that will be used for a number of years, there is this sort of taxpayer equity argument, especially in fast growth districts, where if you were to pay it over, a building, not talking about technology, we'll come back to that in a moment, but if you were to pay for an elementary school over 10, 15 years, that's great, it gets off the debt service from your books, but at the same time, generations of people who come to Belton, the community who use that in 15, 20 years, they didn't pay anything for it. So by kind of stretching out the term of the debt to match the useful life of the asset, it helps, especially in these fast growth districts, for growth to pay for itself. Which is a major reason for doing bonds, is to allow those new people who come into Belton to help support the facilities that they're using. But in terms of the technology, buses, things of that nature, there's an IRS rule that when we sell tax-exempt bonds, we have to match the bond payment to the useful life of the asset. There are a number of tests that we'll do with bond counsel Glenn Opal from Bracewell to make sure that we meet that test. But essentially, we sell one bond. The reason that we sell one bond and not multiple bonds for all the different projects is because there's issuance costs for each bond. So if we were to sell 4 bonds, one 5 years, one 10 years, et cetera, we'd be ending up paying probably quadruple in terms of issuance costs, and that's not good for anyone. So we still sell one bond, but we have multiple purposes within that bond issue and amortize them to match the useful life of the asset. So technology is typically 5 years. You can tell us what the technology asset is, and if it has a useful life, maybe it's 6 years or 4 years, whatever it may be. We'll have to match it to that. Buses, typically we do around 10 years, but again, y'all tell us what it ultimately turns out to be. The buildings will be 30 years, but everything short of that will match the useful life to the bond term.
So the technology will be 5 years?
That's my understanding. We'll have to look at the technology they're funding. There's some technology infrastructure that's hardwired into a school, and that might be a little bit longer. But if we're talking about laptops, iPads, things of that nature, those are typically 5 years or maybe even less.
And then the transportation's going to be 15?
Yeah, and that's something, should our voters pass the bond coming up here, that's something we work with Jennifer on. Again, you only go to the useful lifespan of that. In 15 years is often used, I believe, but we would work with Jennifer and work with our facilities department to make sure we match that up with the useful lifespan of those buses.
So based on what you said, it could be between 10 and 15. We're
Yeah,
just
it'll
not
be
locked into 15.
Whatever your experts tell us
Yes.
it'll be.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll have separate purposes. It'll be allocated. Staff will have access to that. A taxpayer, should they wish to see it, would have access to being able to see the specific amortization schedule as well. So that'll all be available. But yes, it'll be amortized to match the useful life, and by law cannot exceed the useful life of that asset. So you can't go out and sell 30-year bonds for technology. That's not legal.
Mr. Floor? Go ahead, Ty.
I think something that needs to be addressed too is when you look down at the bottom of column F and you see the 677 million, I think that's a number that is jarring to a lot of folks. That's a lot of numbers. So can you elaborate a little bit? I know when a common person purchases a house and they go in and they apply for a house, there's a debt to income ratio that you have to be in a comfort zone for a financial institution to take a risk on you to purchase a home. And then it's based on your income as to what size home you're able to do. How do we work that same scenario with the school district, and what is our debt to income ratio look like now, and what would it look like with the passing of the bond?
I mean, it gets a little complex in terms of the different statistics that we use. We'll use debt to assess valuation, debt per capita, things of that nature. Belton ISD has a AA- bond rating from Standard & Poor's. So you're in that high investment grade category based on the debt. I will say that the rating agencies say that you have a high debt burden, as they do every Texas school district, particularly fast growth Texas school districts, because of the way that Texas funds public education. It's put on the school districts to fund infrastructure. So there's practically nothing that you could do aside, you just couldn't address growth, right? You could have everybody in portables, and that would address that high debt burden. But for a Texas school district to have that AA-, it means that you're on the stronger side of where that is. And with the growth that you've got coming, although this is a large number and hopefully we can reduce it through refinancings as we've been able to do in the past, It's affordable, given that the tax rate still is only projected to be 39 cents and declining. So you're nowhere near the 50 cents. That's kind of the bigger thing that we look at, is that the state sets a cap on what your INS rate can be, and that's 50 cents, and you still have 10 and a half pennies left to get all the way up to that cap. There are a lot of districts that are right up there at that cap. So in terms of the credit quality of Belton ISD, you guys are still on the high investment grade side.
So the way I'm interpreting that with the AA minus rating that we have currently, if this bond is approved by our stakeholders, will that affect our rating at all? Do you anticipate that?
We'll have to go back and we'll have to have that rating renewed. I wouldn't expect there to be any downward pressure. So you're kind of in a double-edged sword here, right? Because if you issue new debt, oh, that's more debt on the books. So from a credit perspective, that's not the greatest thing. But the alternative is not to issue more debt and to have kids coming who have to be in portables, or there's oversized classrooms, and staff and administration can't handle that, and then kids start leaving Belton ISD. So the rating agencies and the investors who will buy these bonds look at, one, how much debt you have outstanding, but secondly, are you addressing the growth and the facilities needs, and they both have to balance each other out. So there's no good answer. If you didn't do this, then okay, but you still have to have kids go somewhere. So are we doing portables, which means they're coming out of the M&O side of the budget, and reducing teacher salaries to compensate for that. So there's no good credit answer. You're in a growth position. Hopefully the state can come out and help to the question that was asked, to provide a little bit more funds for these districts that are fast growth. But adding the new debt is no worse than not doing anything.
So we'll keep our strong rating.
I can never guarantee that, but certainly with the growth in the tax base, the tax base growth means that you can afford this, and you can afford it without any increase and potentially a decrease. That's what the investors will typically look to, is do you have capacity to pay for this? In your case, obviously you do.
And then I've got one more question to go back to the current interest rate. It was what did you say it was?
We are looking at 397.
Okay, so let's just say, for instance, that this bond fails. Well, this isn't going to be the last attempt that Belton ISD has to go and tackle the growth issues that we have. We're coming back with another proposal, I would have to assume, in a year. So is there any way for you guys, because I know what the Fed has said, they're going to have several rate hikes over the next calendar year. We've already had one or two.
We've had one.
One.
And
we have,
we're
what,
approaching the one next week, should be 50 basis points.
But we're going to have probably 4 more probably in the next year, or
They
3?
said up to 7 for the year.
Up to 7. So just for the folks out there that are on the fence as to whether or not this is a good idea now, where will we be a year from now? And like you said a minute ago, that the effectiveness of our borrowing, or the bang for the buck, is going to be quite a bit less. Can you talk about that for just a minute so people can understand that?
So typically we always get up here and we say, this is a good time to borrow because interest rates are low, and maybe they're going to stay low for a while. We don't really have a good indication one way or the other, but it's very clear that the Fed has a very strong intention to continue raising interest rates. And so far, the municipal bond market has priced every increase in the Fed funds into, and more so, into our interest rate. So by the end of the year, there's been projections that interest rates could be 1 to 1.25% higher than they are today. So if we're talking potentially about 3.99, call it 4%, we could certainly, in a year from now, when you potentially would sell, so a May election in 23, a sell in the summer of 23, we could be looking at in the low to mid 5% range. And so what that ultimately means is either you have to downsize the projects, and with construction costs where they are and inflation and all that, I don't know if that's a reasonable expectation, or pay more in terms of maybe at that point we're not talking about a decrease of a penny in the tax rate, maybe we're talking about an increase in the tax rate to get the same amount of money.
So not only if this doesn't pass, are we looking at at least a 1.5 increase in the interest rates? Potentially, because they're having to combat this inflation that we're seeing. But it could end up being where instead of having a level tax rate that we have now, although people say we don't, but we do, or we could potentially lower our INS, more than likely a year from now, we're going to look, if we want to do something else, we're going to have to raise taxes at that point.
Absolutely. If you were to not pass this bond and lower the INS rate, there would be really virtually no possibility that you could do the next election without an increase.
I think important thing to note too, Jennifer, in column M, if you take a look at the INS tax rate and the way it's modeled on this, she mentioned this earlier, and I don't want to gloss over that for the board. It is modeled at 39 cents for the next year, but it is decreasing after that in every subsequent year almost. Is that
Yes, that's
fair to
absolutely
say?
correct. And
Okay.
so hopefully what that means is that 5 years from now, whenever it is that you start talking about the next bond, that there's again capacity to perhaps do something without a rate increase at that time, or a lesser rate increase than you might otherwise need. So this is being modeled because you have debt paying off every year, and because we have growth in the tax base, and to Dr. Smith's point as well, this assumes, again, only 7.5% growth the year after, and then 5% after that. So the more it grows quicker than that, and we're only kind of changing this year's expectation to 15%. So hopefully that'll start to drop off even quicker, and you can either provide relief to the taxpayers or use that additional capacity for additional projects that may come along to address growth.
And I share that simply because as Jennifer talks through this, I think it's important to always note, one, we're conservative in estimates when we run all of these things, and Jennifer does a really good job with that. And two, this is similar to what you've done in Belton ISD in other bond elections, et cetera. You have continued to model to project increased interest in sinking rates or decreased interest in sinking rates over the life of those bonds. That's a good thing, and you've seen it play out with our tax rates over the past 5 years. I share that because that shows your continued focus on impact on the taxpayers in this district, even when we talk about new projects that require bond elections. Jennifer, one quick question that I want to make sure that we address too is the use of bond funds for major capital improvements or major maintenance items in the school district. Is that typical from your perspective?
So I know the question has arisen, and I believe your bond attorney provided some information from Attorney General Paxton to support that. But certainly bonds are issued for new projects as well as for renovations. I mean, there's no point in tearing down a school if it's pretty good if you can renovate it to make it obviously functional for today's needs and kids. So absolutely, I would say that there's significant portions of bond issues across statewide school district bond issues to support maintenance and renovations of existing facilities, to expand extend the useful life of those facilities.
Quick question, something that's out there, and I want to address it. One, based on the data you provided here, and of course we're not advocating for or against the bond up here, just talking the math behind it, that if the data was to hold your conservative values here, we'd actually, even with the bond passing, would be able to drop the tax rate by a cent based on what you have here.
Yes, sir.
And this is really the question I want to make sure, because it's been put out there, is there's an idea that if this bond were to pass, and that was calling with a level tax rate, much less the idea that it would somehow go down based on increased values, but that, somehow this board would come back like the next year and decide, well, we're just going to raise it now because we didn't set it correct the first time. Can you address that?
So the board doesn't have the authority to increase the rate because you feel like it, right? So state law is very clear that the debt service portion of the tax rate can only be used to pay existing debt service, and the voters have the final say. They approve what your existing debt service is. So if the voters in Belton ISD decide not to approve any new bonds, this is the most that we'll ever be able to levy the tax for, so it would obviously continue to drop. So you don't have the authority to increase it. You can only set the rate based on the existing debt and the taxable assessed valuation of the district, and that it's a math calculation.
And you were very clear, though, but to be clear, if the bond were to pass and, a year, 2 years from now, there's no going back and saying, sorry, voters, now we're going to raise the rate. That has to be voted on every single time. We don't have that ability.
Well, so the only caveat I'll say here is if for some reason the tax base declined, so if all of a sudden everybody's property value went from $300,000 to $100,000, then at that point you would be forced to levy a higher tax rate. So if we're ever in a position where tax values community-wide start to decrease, then that would be the alternative. I'm sure people would like it if their tax values stopped increasing at the same rate that they are, but I don't know that any of us would count on that scenario happening anytime in the near future. But that would be the only case in which you could increase the tax rate.
Okay, thank you.
you had used a 7.5% projection in terms of giving us an idea what would happen if, the bond was approved, right? So that is a really, really conservative figure, wouldn't you say?
It is for today,
Right.
but a few years ago, it was actually a little bit high for Belton ISD.
Okay. So when you say a few years ago, how far back?
I want to say your average has been about 5-6% over the last, excluding this 15% year over the prior 5 years. And I don't have that in front of me, but
Right,
that was my
right.
recollection, is that it was
So-
somewhere in that neighborhood.
So in this day and age, 7.5% is an incredibly conservative figure, right?
I mean, I feel like it is, but we're saying that with the benefit of hindsight.
Right.
When we didn't know what was happening. But yes, sir, given what's just come out from the appraisal district, that is extremely conservative.
Right. So I started to ask Melissa earlier, based upon the conversation that I had with a couple of folks here in the last couple of days when they received their tax appraisal. If the bond were to pass, based upon the information that you have in front of you, and now that we have some assessed value, is the tax benefit, let me rephrase that question. Is there going to be a tax increase based upon the bond passing?
No, sir.
Okay. So if there's going to be a tax increase that...
Well, I should say tax rate increase, I'm sorry, for an individual homeowner
tax
for their
rate.
appraisal.
But there would be a tax rate increase because I'm paying more on the assessed value, right?
Tax payment increase, not
Tax payment
tax rate.
increase, right,
Yeah.
right.
And
Not
to
a
clarify.
tax, not a rate increase,
Correct.
right?
Right.
But I'm going to pay more, my taxes are going to go up because of the assessed value.
So it's hard to say. In theory, yes. Probably most homeowners in Belton received a bill that said that there, as Melissa pointed out, there's the market value, then you can only, if you got the homestead, you can only go up 10% in 1 year. So it is, in theory, possible that this year, if it goes up by 10%, depending on the value of the home, if they receive that additional $15,000 homestead exemption, if it's passed by the voters on May 7th, it could be that this is the 1 year when they don't see much of an increase, but I can't speak to that as an individual calculation.
Right.
But because of that additional homestead, this year might not be as bad as people are anticipating.
And you would give me the same answer if there was no bond on the table right now, there was no bond election. It would be the same answer, right?
Yeah, even if there's no bonds and your appraisal goes up, then your tax bill can go up.
Right. So because there is a bond, and if the voters approve it, there's not going to be an increase, right?
Correct.
Right. And I know I'm sounding like I'm beating a dead horse, but I keep hearing that from folks in the community that have that conception that there's somehow a connection between this bond and an increase in taxes when there is not.
I mean, it's purely the assessed value, right?
Right,
As
okay.
I think the CFO did a good job of
Hey,
pointing out.
Manuel, I've got a quick one. Can you elaborate a little bit on the 10%? I think that's something that people don't understand. This is really complex. I'm sorry, but I don't get upset when I see misinformation out there because I think sometimes this is really, really hard for folks to grasp. I get upset when I see people who aren't trying to understand and yet they're still putting things out there that aren't. But can you explain to people, let's say that your valuation went up this year 50%. Explain to people the tax that they're going to pay this next year increase.
So it's a bit of a nuanced situation, and I'm not a tax assessor, so that's a little bit out of my wheelhouse. But my understanding of it is that you have a 10% cap if you have a homestead exemption, and I think you've had to have the home exemption since the prior year. Mm-hmm. So it can't be that you just go and apply right now and you get the 10%. But if you've had the homestead exemption, so it can't be your second home, it can't be a business. So if you've got that homestead exemption in your second year, then you're capped at your assessed value. Market value can go up 150%, but your assessed value that you're actually taxed on can only go up 10% in a calendar year. The next year, so let's say it grows 50%. Well, if nothing else changed after that year, it's going to take the tax office 5 years to catch up, right? Because it's going to go up 10% every year. So after 5 years, you'll be paying your market value. But it can only go up 10% in 1 year.
If I could, I'd like to invite Melissa up real quickly. Melissa did a little simulation for you all, and it's at your table there. It says property taxes in summary is the heading on it. And so if I could have you take a look at that, and we'll make sure this is uploaded. But we had a gut feeling that something like this would pop up tonight, and so Melissa put together a little model for you to consider. Again, it's a paper sitting in front of you, property taxes in summary. Melissa, you want to walk us through the important pieces of that because it directly addresses Ty's question.
Sure. So at the bottom of that document, and I don't know if we have it on overhead, but at the bottom of that document, I've kind of created your typical tax statement and took out a few of the lines, the pluses and minuses in the tax statement, just to simplify this down for us to see. So basically, when taxpayers receive that statement, the first line that they're going to see is last year's market value, and then they're also going to see this year's current market value that the appraisal district is sending out. So for both years, you can see basically there's a productivity loss that gets deducted off of that market value, and then it arrives at that assessed value that you are taxed at that value. Now, you can see that this is just a hypothetical $300,000 home market value. So a $100,000 increase in market value, what this does. So in the previous year, the assessed value, if you were to grow that 10%, you can see that would have been approximately, hypothetically, $280,000. And then as you go to the current tax year, that's growing. That can only grow 10%. There's a cap on that assessed value. So then you would be taxed that $308,000. As you go down in the, calculation to calculate your taxes, last year you would have experienced a $25,000 homestead exemption if you had the homestead exemption the previous year is the requirement. You would have enjoyed that. And then for the current year, with that additional $15,000 increase in that exemption, you're enjoying a $40,000 exemption. So you're getting a little more tax relief just in the increase of that exemption to arrive at that taxable value. Okay? That taxable value then takes our tax rate and applies our tax rate per $100 of value. So basically take that value divided by $100 and apply our tax rate to that value, and that will give you the total tax due. And so you can see between the 2 years that increase of $100,000 in market value that's still kind of being held in that assessed value, being capped at that assessed value, that taxpayer would only see a $139 increase in their tax bill. And that's both the INS tax rate and the M&O tax rate applied.
And that model is not considering any drop in the maintenance and operations tax rate, or is it, just to be clear?
That would be my projected compressed rate for next year.
So it would drop
yes, sir.
it just a little?
So it's still compressing.
Yeah. And so we share that just for illustration purposes because I do think it's important to note, number one thing is always about how it impacts people in our district. And we know that that's what people are talking about right now. You get that appraised value and you take a look at that and you get the market shock that everybody is feeling in the area. The way things work and all of this, I think Melissa's done a good job showing you how that could play out for taxpayers should that homestead exemption and continued maintenance and operations tax rate compression continue for us.
Question. Melissa, looking at your example here, if we add to your hypothetical, let's assume this is a taxpayer here in our district, right? And we add to the hypothetical that there was a bond in place and that bond was approved by the voters. Those numbers would not change, would they?
No, sir, they would not.
So the only reason they changed was because the assessed value went up or the
Yes,
appraised
sir.
value went up,
It's
right?
those values, and again, you're getting that relief of that cap of 10% on that assessed value.
Okay, all right. Thank you, ma'am. I have one more question for Jennifer, if I could.
Thank you, Melissa.
Jennifer, you mentioned when you were doing your presentation that, or maybe it was in response to a question, that through the work of not necessarily this board, but to some extent, I've only been on this board since 2018, but you mentioned the last 10 years. So the work of this board and boards prior to us, I think, of course, Suzanne, I think, was on this board. There was a savings of $18.3 million.
That's correct.
Now, is that common, or do boards have to be engaged in trying to manage the debt service to make sure that we can pass any savings on to the taxpayer that we are able to do?
You know, I want to say it's, I feel like you did good, right? So I don't necessarily want to say it's common, because you really do have to stay on top of it. You have to have an engaged CFO, you know, a board who's willing to take a look at these and be flexible in terms of, you know, putting it on their agenda, doing it quickly potentially, should there be the opportunity to have any savings. So, and also kind of reserving and not taking every refunding because it saves a little bit of money if we can wait and save a lot of money. So your board's been good about making the right decisions. So I would say that you've been better than average.
And we've been conservative. Would you
You've
agree
been
with
absolutely
that?
conservative.
Right.
Yeah, there's been refunding opportunities that weren't probably in your best interest that you passed on,
Right.
so you could save more money down the road.
And looking at at these columns and looking at the, you know, like in column M, and if we look at this information as a whole, there's no reason why, if we continue doing things that we're doing here with the administrative staff, the chief financial officer that's engaged, obviously, there's no reason why that trend should not continue. That is, provide savings to the taxpayers whenever we can.
I would absolutely expect it to continue.
Right,
I mean, it's
okay.
part of our job as well, is to monitor the market and make sure that we bring it every time we have to your CFO, there's an opportunity to save. So that is, you've got a number of eyes looking at it.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Real quick, Jennifer, something else I was point out, looking at your chart here, and you know I've always loved your charts.
You're the only one.
It is a conservative estimate. You know, you dropped it down to 15%, which is actually at 20% right now. And then you drop it to 7.5% for a couple of years. And then we drop down to 5%. And then we start dropping down to 3%, which is extremely conservative. I don't know the last time Belton ISD only grew at 3% as far as values.
Probably like 2009.
And that's perfect because it's a conservative view, and that's what we like. And this would be assuming that the bond passed. Even with that, it looks like, you know, the rates are going to steadily keep dropping. You know, we have a couple of years where they're going to hold steady. Again, you project that we could drop rates this next year, but then they're going to start dropping substantially after that based on your conservative views. But one thing that you brought up in regards to something that Ty had said is this assumes that things are passed at today's market and today's interest rates versus a year from now that we assume that interest rates are going to be higher. And like you said, that rate would have to go up to cover the same amount of bond at that point. And that's going to affect our ability to keep dropping this rate as quickly as we have been.
That's correct.
Okay.
And I think, too, one of the reason that it's dropping, because you're being conservative, you're paying off things when you can, as well as this bond may not cover all the growth that you've got over the next 10, 15 years, right? So your job is difficult because you got to plan for today's needs as well as needs down the road and have the opportunity to be able to fund those when you need them. So you've always taken a conservative look, and we try and pay off the bonds as quickly as possible. We're not deferring principal far down the road like some districts do. You're paying it off quickly to kind of maximize the savings for the taxpayers as well as allow for capacity in 10 years, whenever you might need it for this new group of kids and families who are moving here.
Okay. And then I want to ask, Ms. Lee, can you hear us? Okay, do you have any questions? Okay, I think that's a no from her. Oh.
You guys did a great job stealing the questions, so awesome. I do have an M&O question, if I can circle back to that. So let's exhaust INS, and then we'll go back. Yeah.
Ms. McDonald? Oh, okay. M&O question for Ms. Ritter?
Yeah. No, for Melissa, if you've got a second. Yeah. So there's been a little bit of discussion around what M&O pays for, right? What can you pay for with M&O? And we know that largely for us, right, 84% of it is salaries and benefits, right? So from a school standpoint, if we look across Texas, right, I know you may not have the exact answer, but what is typically that percentage of M&O applied to salaries and benefits across the state? Do you know?
The percentage of M&O, as far as our budget, we're at around 84%. Make sure I'm understanding the question.
Yeah, so my understanding is, actually, it's across the state, yeah, I'm trying to figure out how we compare, right? My understanding is that across the state, it's in that low 80s, actually, pretty consistently, or at least the average, so.
Yeah, Melissa might be able to answer that. I can tell you from my perspective, what I know on that is that typically around 80 to 84% is pretty normal.
Right, pretty standard.
But then in fast growth school districts, you sometimes see it quite higher than that. And
Right.
that is due to the adding of additional staff that are
Right.
required by grade levels or required by new buildings.
Right.
And so as you add schools, if you have more students come in, remember there's some state law that requires us to have class sizes at certain points. As more students come in, more staff is hired to serve those students. And again, in a fast growth school districts, you see that usually a little higher, often a little higher than other districts.
And that might be something, that as a, moving forward, a report that we'd like to see is what a typical district and then what a fast growth district, just see the numbers.
And just see what
'Cause
that
I've seen
looks
the
like.
chart with our INS rate, with the local fast growth, Liberty Hill, Manor, Salado, and then it's us and Bastrop, like 11 cents lower than everybody else. So we've really done a good job through the years of keeping that really, really low, even though we have been on this trajectory for a long time. But that might be cool to see on a report moving forward,
Sure.
is those averages on the M&O.
You're talking about just the tax rate itself,
Yeah,
not really
yes.
the budget.
Just compare us to fast growth districts and then just the state average, just so we could put that out there.
Sure. Now, everybody remembers there's two parts to that M&O tax rate. There's the maximum compressed rate that the state calculates for us, and then so the only piece that creates that deviation between all of us, of course, values affects all of the districts' compressed rate. So it kind of, again, you're at the mercy of what their values are versus our values. However, that other portion of that M&O tax rate is that tier 2 portion, and to increase that, you'd have to do a tax rate increase and take it out to the voters. So depending on the community, some of them are more palatable to that tax rate increase than other communities.
So Chris, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going down the line.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay,
Go ahead.
Manuel, go ahead.
Chris, in response to your question, are you asking, and I think, I mean, a great question, but I think we want to see a comparison between fast growth districts and our district in terms of the percentage of M&O that goes to salaries and benefits, right?
Right.
Okay. Which Matt says it's typically in the, we're in the,
I think we'll typically find 80 to 85% is pretty normal.
Right.
And then
That's my
fast growth school
understanding.
districts is a little bit, sometimes a little higher than that. Again, that's all based on how your district finances are structured over a number of years.
So if you'll remember too, in proportion to a school district's budget, all the school districts across the state have done teacher pay increases, right? And then that basic allotment is really not increasing. And so that's where everybody's starting to feel the squeeze on their budgets, is that we're trying to retain teachers, and get them into our districts, trying to increase those salaries, but at the same time, our revenue isn't growing in relation to that. So depending on how districts basically allocate their budgets, you'll see that fluctuation in the percentages.
I do want to make one clarification too, on when we talk, we threw the term fast growth school districts out around. There's specific qualification criteria to be a fast growth school district. And not all school districts around us qualify for that. So when you compare us to our neighbors, they are not considered fast growth school districts in Temple and Killeen versus other districts in the area that are considered fast growth school districts. So just always want to point that out when Ty mentioned that specific chart that has been used in some of our bond presentations. It's important to note that's comparing fast growth school districts, not with local school districts.
and Matt, and elaborate, well, take it a step further, even though there may be other districts around that are not fast growth, some of the others have higher INS ratings than we do, and ours is lower.
That's
than
correct.
theirs.
And there are districts around the state with various circumstances. Can't talk to all of them, but they're definitely with higher INS rates than Belton ISD.
And they're not fast growth.
Correct.
Right.
Ms. McDonald? All right, making my way around the table. All right, thank you very much. Okay, well, appreciate everyone's time. Appreciate Representative Shine being here, and Ms. Ritter, thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Lafferty. And there being no further business, this meeting is adjourned at 6:29.
Thank you, Board.